Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. In this episode, we'll talk about adding fat to a dough. Gluten is made up of two proteins called glutenin and gliadin. It's when you add water to your flour and hydrate it, when glutenin and gliadin create gluten. So if you imagine that these little dots are the two proteins, you add your water, they connect, and you get gluten. Simple as that. But unlike water, if you add fat to your flour, it coats the proteins. And the coating will inhibit gluten formation. So you do want to create some gluten before you add any fat to your dough, basically is what I'm trying to say. But enough of illustrations, let's do some real life examples. We're going to make two enriched doughs. In the first example, I'll do it the proper way. I'll develop the gluten and then add the fat, which is butter in this case. But in the second one, we'll add the butter right away from the get-go. We'll see the difference. The ingredients are exactly the same for both of them. Milk, salt, yeast, sugar, butter, and flour. So in the bowl, I've added the milk, yeast, salt, sugar. I will give it all a good mix to hydrate the yeast and dissolve any large sugar crystals. Now add the flour. And this is how you make most doughs. Just start mixing with a scraper till you don't see any more dry flour. Then get out on your table and start kneading. This dough is not too sticky, so I'll use a regular kneading method. And we'll knead it for around 3 minutes. That will give us enough time to develop the gluten, just enough so that we can add the butter. So around 3 minutes into the process, I can feel the dough becoming nice and smooth and a little bit stretchy. And now we can add the butter. And I will always suggest using this method, especially if you are using a large amount of butter in relation to the flour. So what you want to do is stretch your dough out on the table till it's nice and thin. Now grab the butter, make sure it's soft. Just slap it on there, smear it in, squeeze it in, squish it in. There's not really any right or wrong here. Just mash it up for around 30 seconds until it starts absorbing into the dough. And then you can continue kneading it. Now at this point, depending on how hydrated your dough is and how much fat you are using, you might have to switch up kneading methods. Whereas before I could press down on the table, now it feels quite sticky. So we'll continue with the stretch and fold. But regardless of what method is being used, all you're trying to do now is continue kneading the dough until sufficient gluten development. I kept on kneading it for around 5 minutes. And of course, depending on how much fat you're adding, it may take less time or it may take longer. But it's been around 8 minutes in total. And now I can feel the dough. It's not that sticky anymore. I can stretch it out. It's nice and elastic. And I'm happy that it's ready for proofing. So shape it into a ball, get it out of the way. I'll show you the second method, which is, in my opinion, the wrong method. So we'll start off with the same ingredients: flour, milk, yeast, salt, sugar, butter. But this time, we'll add the milk, yeast, salt, sugar, and the butter into the bowl right away. And then add the flour and start mixing. And like I mentioned in the beginning, the fat will coat the flour and inhibit gluten development. Now don't get me wrong, if you're making a dough with just a little splash of olive oil or maybe 15 grams of butter, you can do it this way. In this example here, I'm adding 50 grams of butter to a dough which is made up of 250 grams of flour, which makes it a 20% fat dough. And that is a relatively high number. And that's why I do advise adding fat later into the dough. So at this point the dough still looks quite normal, but once we start kneading, you really feel the difference. And I'll start off just as I did earlier, by pressing down and forwards and folding the dough, using a regular kneading method as I call it. But right away I can feel that it's quite sticky and messy. So we'll continue on with the stretch and fold. And just as before, we'll give the dough 8 minutes of kneading. Now you may ask yourself, what if I just knead for longer? I might just develop the gluten, right? And while that is true, you gotta remember that the longer you knead it, the more it will warm up. And if your dough warms up too much, you'll run into all kinds of problems. So it has been 8 minutes. I can definitely feel this dough is a lot more sticky. When I try to stretch it, it tears right away. There's a distinct difference. Now let's compare these side by side. The dough on the right is the one which had the butter added later on in the kneading process. The correct dough. I can definitely feel that it's nice and smooth. When I pick it up and stretch it out, I can easily do the window pane test. It's nice and glutinous, as you can see. So let's check on the other one. As I mentioned earlier, this dough feels a lot more sticky, it's rougher, and as soon as I stretch it, it does tear quite easily. So you can clearly see here which one will produce a better loaf. Now let's do one more extreme example. Let's say you're making focaccia and you want to add some olive oil. I have 50 grams of olive oil here for a dough which is made up of 250 grams of flour. Again, quite a large ratio. If you try to knead it in by hand, you'll be there all day. But because focaccia dough is quite stretchy, it does benefit from a series of folds during the fermentation process. And that is exactly how we're going to incorporate the oil into the dough. Just get your dough into the bowl, add the oil, and give it a fold. And if you want to learn more about folding dough, click the link in the top right corner. The main thing to note here is that it's not going to happen all at once. This is quite an extreme example of how much oil we're adding to the dough. So this will take about 4, 5, 6 folds. And in this example, I'll do them in 15-minute intervals during the bulk fermentation stage. So this is the second fold basically. And as you keep going, the dough will absorb more and more of the oil. And at first it will seem like it's not going to work, but just keep at it and it will all come together. So this is fold number 3. Cover it up again, let it ferment. Fold number 4. But as I mentioned earlier, if you just want to add a splash of olive oil, you can add it into the dough before you start kneading it. It's no big deal. But with such a large amount, you'll just end up with porridge. So it's been about 5 folds. I'll give it one more fold before I get out my paper for the final fermentation. And as you can see now, there's no more oil in the bowl. It's all been folded into the dough. This is also a good method for folding in other ingredients, like olives or roasted vegetables, or cheese or whatever you would like to use. Now we'll leave it to ferment one more time before going in the oven. The dough is puffed up beautifully, it's full of bubbles, it's nice and wobbly, there's plenty of gluten, even though we added loads of oil. And of course, since it's a focaccia, just get some more olive oil on the top as well. But in short, that's how you add fat to a dough. A couple of different methods, rights and wrongs. I hope you learned something. I know I did. The main thing to remember is that you do want to develop that gluten. Without it, the dough is not going to rise properly, you will struggle with shaping it, it's not going to puff up in the oven properly, and that is why it's important. But as always, if you have any questions or suggestions, drop them down in comments. Maybe I missed something. And subscribe to my channel for loads more bread baking videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.